us as we return from a short break and begin a new series. City Bible Forum runs Bible Shots because we think the Bible has relevant, powerful, and essential things for us to grapple with. So we set aside time during the business of the week to consider what the Bible has to say. If you're someone who doesn't consider yourself to be a follower of Jesus, we're glad you can tune in today. This forum is open to anyone who's willing to consider what the Bible has to say. So if you have more questions, thoughts, or comments, please get in touch with either Lachlan or myself at the end of the meeting, and we'd love to keep chatting. If you've never joined us before, it's a pretty simple meeting. We read part of the Bible, listen to a talk, and then we have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, please send them through using the Q&A function on Zoom, or if you're joining us live through Facebook, you can paste them in the comments section. So in our new series of talks, our very own Lachlan Orr will help us navigate the topic of uncertain future as we look at the Old Testament book called Ruth. So hey, Lachlan, how are you?
Hey, Martin. Good. Yeah. Didn't have the best sleep last night, but otherwise, great.
That's great. Well, thank you for taking on a new series from the Book of Ruth. I personally love this book, well, because it's short and easy to read. But I just wondered why you chose this book, in particular, Book of Ruth, to help us think about uncertain future.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I think, like you said, it is a real favorite book in the Bible. It's really a great, sweet story. But as I'll say in the talk, it's also about people who are living through really uncertain times and really faces the reality of life. And that's kind of what a lot of us are going through now. We're facing a really uncertain future. And so I think it does tap into issues that we're grappling with now, but it does it in a way that is actually, not as confronting as it otherwise might be. It's doing it through looking at a really nice story that does have a happy ending, and it's just a good, fun story to read.
Okay, sounds good. All right, let me share the passage from the Bible, from the Book of Ruth, and share the screen with you. All right. And it comes from chapter 1 in the Book of Ruth. Let me read from chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is better for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Over to you, Lachlan.
Fantastic. Thank you, Martin. Well, we're in the midst of one of the most extended global periods of uncertainty that many of us have ever faced in our lives. And in the midst of this uncertainty, where can you find lasting peace? In case you missed Martin's welcome before, g'day everyone, great to have you along at Bible Shots. I'm Lachlan, and it's really good to have you here as we consider part of the Bible and what it means for us today. One of the things I love about looking at the Bible is that it actually raises big questions for everyone to grapple with, questions that we all grapple with at some point in our lives. And today we're grappling with the question, where can you find lasting peace in the midst of uncertainty? And we're grappling with that question as we start our new series, taking a closer look at the book of Ruth. Now, Ruth tells what is arguably the sweetest story in the Bible. It's full of drama and romance, and that makes for a nice change of pace than some of the things going on in our uncertain times. But while it is a sweet story, Ruth doesn't hide from the reality that life is anything but straightforward. Life can be full of uncertainty, disappointment, and grief. Now, before we get stuck into the passage, just a couple of quick comments. This story does assume a biblical worldview. It assumes that God is active behind events in the world. If you don't share that perspective, or if you're still thinking that through, that's fine. We can look at this story together and it still raises profound questions for us to think through. Of course, I'd be happy to talk with you further about the question of God and his place as the world, but this story raises big questions for everyone to consider. But we also need to keep in mind that the book of Ruth, it comes from a very different time and place. A very different culture to ours. Some parts are going to seem strange and foreign, and they might even grate against us. And that's okay. Some of those I'll address as we go through, but if there is something that you want to dig a little bit deeper on, I'd love to hear your questions when we get to Q&A time. So today we're focusing on Ruth chapter 1 that Martin just read out for us, and what it contributes to answering the question, where can you find lasting peace in the midst of uncertainty? And we're going to do it in 3 parts. We're going to see a time of troubles, the return, and a bittersweet ending as we look at the passage. And we'll finish off thinking a little bit about what this part of the Bible has to say to us today. And we'll be finished a little bit after 1:30 because we were a little bit late getting started. But our story opens in a time of troubles. In the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land. Now, when you start reading a book or watching a movie, I think the best opening lines, they grab your attention and they instantly give you important information for the story you're about to hear. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. A Tale of Two Cities. It's a story set in a time of great hope for some and great despair for others in the midst of revolutionary times. A long time ago, in a galaxy far away. This is a story that is going to have an almost fairy tale-like quality to it as you start watching Star Wars. In the days when the judges ruled, well, that actually places our story, Ruth, at a very particular point in history. At the time of the judges, it covers about 300 years from around 1350 BC to 1050 BC. And in some ways, it's a little bit like the Wild West of the Bible. It was a time of lawlessness. It was a time of oppressive foreign regimes and natural disasters taking their toll on the nation of Israel. And on the Bible's account, those two things were related. It was because it was a time of lawlessness, a time where the people of Israel ignored God's laws, that God allowed foreign oppression and other natural disasters to occur. Our story opens in a time of troubles. And amidst those troubles, we meet a man who is just trying to survive. I don't know about you, but when we meet Elimelech and hear that he left Israel because of a famine to live in another country, I think, sure, makes sense. He's just trying to survive. And that's what Moab offered, a chance to survive and live life. And in a country like Australia, where so many of us have relatives within living memory who've moved here from somewhere else, moving to a new country doesn't seem that odd. Many of us are here because we or a close relative decided to move here for the chance of a better life. But there's more going on in the story. See, when the narrator draws our attention to this happening at the time of the judges, it clues us in to think a little bit more carefully about whether this is actually a smart move. You see, at this point in the big story of the Bible, God had given Israel the land they were in. Yes, there was a famine, but God had promised his people that when they started living his ways again, he'd make sure that they had plenty to live a full life. Why was this family leaving God's land instead of turning back to God? And why were they going to Moab, of all places? Moab was one of Israel's great enemies. When Israel came out of Egypt about a century or so before the time of the judges, the king of Moab took numerous steps to stop Israel. More recently, in the time of the judges, Israel had suffered at the hands of another king of Moab, the fat king Eglon. He was one of the oppressive rulers that we mentioned earlier. When you think about what's going on here against the backdrop that the Bible paints, it really raises questions about what is Elimelech doing with his family. Yes, he's just trying to survive, but when you think about it, this doesn't seem like a wise venture. And in fact, it's a venture doomed to failure. See, in the face of famine, Moab literally offered greener pastures. In the face of a bleak and uncertain future, it offered a sense of security. But ultimately, this family aren't going to find that. They're not going to find peace that lasts in Moab. They left Israel to escape the looming threat of poverty and death, but it still catches up with them. Elimelech dies. But the family, they continue their life in Moab. The two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they marry a couple of local girls, Orpah and Ruth, and they continue living in Moab for 10 years. Moab does continue to offer a measure of security and stability, but once again, it does not last. Mahlon and Chilion die, leaving Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth once again facing a more uncertain and bleak future. And despite seeking what they thought was the best option for a peaceful and secure existence, they ultimately had no shelter from the uncertainties of life and the reality of death. Where can you find peace that lasts? It's a question that this family was trying to answer, and we get the answer pretty quickly. Not in Moab. Moab was never going to solve their problem. And it's the same for us today. Whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, the start of the story confronts us with the reality that, well, there's nowhere in this world that is free from uncertainty. Some places might offer more security in the short term. It's one of the reasons why so many people have decided to move to Australia. But one of the confronting realities of coronavirus has been that it's highlighted just how limited our control is and the little certainty about the future that we can have. It actually gives us a chance to ask some deep and maybe confronting questions of ourselves. Where do you seek peace and security? Is it a job? Is it a family? Living in a particular suburb? How secure is what you seek peace in? Can it offer peace that lasts, or can it really only offer a likely buffer from the problems of the world? If there are questions you haven't pondered before, or maybe for a while, it might be worthwhile taking some time, sometime this afternoon or over the next week, to actually think them through a bit more. Maybe with a diary, maybe in a conversation with someone who you trust. And if you don't feel like you have anyone, please feel free to let us know through the Bible Shots email address. That's bibleshots@citybibleforum.org. And I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. But ultimately, when you think about it, there's nowhere in this world that is free from uncertainty. Well, to go back to the story, we've seen that ultimately peace can't be found in Moab. Is there any way to have peace that lasts? Well, in verse 6, Naomi hears the news that the famine she fled all those years ago had ended. God provided food for his people, and there's a glimmer of hope in a bleak situation. And it kicks off the return journey, and I think it starts to offer us an alternative of where we might look to find peace that lasts. And it's not so much about being in the right place as it is about knowing the right person. You see, as Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth head off to the land of Israel, I think the narrator wants us to see there's more going on than a trio of women making a geographical move. Between verses 6 and 22, the word return is used 12 times. Now, that might not sound very interesting until you realize that returning or turning, it's a really significant idea in the Old Testament. It doesn't just relate to a physical turning, but a spiritual turning. That is a turning back to God. And it's not just Naomi who's returning. So are her daughters-in-law. They are turning from their land and their people and their gods to join Naomi and her people and her God. And while the story confronts us with the ultimate lack of peace and security that can be found in the world around us, though, it starts to give us this glance at an alternative and raises the question, can peace be found if you know God? Well, Naomi's response is clear. Come with me, serve my God, and everything will be well for you. You'll have a comfortable life for the rest of your days. Well, I mean, that's what I would say if I were trying to persuade people that the God of the Bible is the God to follow. But Naomi says exactly the opposite. Naomi sits her daughters down, has a heart-to-heart with them, and warns them, heading to Israel is not going to be sunshine and roses. She says, I can't give you the good life. If you want your best shot at a peaceful life, go back to Moab. Moab is the place for you. Now, there's some details in the speech that might raise a couple of questions. In the ancient world, women were much more dependent on the men in their lives. One of the reasons it was so important that women got married and had children, especially sons, was that sons would be able to act on their behalf in certain situations, and they'd be the ones who make sure you were fed and provided for into your old age. There wasn't a social welfare system like we have today. And so one of the ways that childless widows were looked after in that society is that they would marry their deceased husband's brother. Now, we might balk at that, but it helped to make sure that vulnerable people weren't left out in the cold. And Naomi can't do this for Orpah and Ruth, hence her over-the-top speech that underlines just how hopeless their situation will be if they follow her back to Israel. Even if she were married and later that day conceived twin sons, there's still a long way to go before those sons were going to be anywhere near able to provide Orpah and Ruth with families of their own. If you want a full life, girls, go back to Moab, is what she says. Of course, we've seen already that Moab is no guarantee that they're going to get the outcome they want. But Naomi says it's your best bet for a comfortable life. Following me, joining my people, following my God, it's no guarantee of a comfortable life. It's no guarantee of lasting peace. And Orpah listens. She decides to play the numbers and she takes the best shot she has at the most comfortable existence she's likely to get. She goes back to Moab. It's life with uncertainty, but the most pragmatic in terms of your day-to-day outcomes. But this is where Ruth, the titular character of the book, is different. See, instead, she gives one of the most moving speeches, I think, recorded in history. You know, there's certain speeches that stick in your mind. You know, their passion, their zeal, their rightness, they resonate. They stick with you. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And I think this speech of Ruth's is in the same caliber. Verse 16, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. It's one of those speeches that just blows your mind. Despite the fact that her best bet for the best life she could live involves going back to Moab, Ruth decides to opt for an alternative. She sticks with Naomi in a way that involves a complete change of identity. Come what may, she committed herself to Naomi, to Naomi's people, and critically, Naomi's God. The question is, will this alternative way to pursue life be worth it? Will she find lasting peace? Is the ending going to be sweet or bitter? And of course, as we read the story, when they get back to Israel, everything was great. They had ample food, a big family gathered around to support them. Ruth was welcomed in. Everyone lives happily ever after. Following God leads to prosperity and is the key to lasting peace. Except that's not what happens. By the end of this part of the story, neither Ruth or Naomi are actually in a great place. We are far from a happy ending. Despite her dedication to Naomi and her willingness to turn away from her people and her God and to join Naomi's people and Naomi's God, there's clues that actually suggest Ruth is left out in the cold. You know, after her incredible speech, that speech that makes you sit up and take notice and say, this woman is incredible. We read, well, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. I mean, it's an underwhelming response at best, but in the original language, it more literally says she refrained from speaking to her. And it kind of leaves the hint that that long journey back to Israel might have been accompanied by a prolonged, awkward silence. Naomi refrained from speaking to her. We hinted at this before, but Moabites weren't exactly kosher. Naomi is bringing back someone who was historically an enemy of her people, someone who would be a reminder of the fact that she had left God's land and God's people. In all likelihood, Ruth would be something of an embarrassment and maybe even a liability when she got back to Israel. We're kind of left wondering if Naomi was hoping that Ruth would take the hint and go back to where she came from. Once she's back in Bethlehem, when Naomi does speak, she declares that she is bitter and empty. She has nothing. Despite Ruth's moving speech of dedication to Naomi, well, we're left with the impression that Naomi doesn't really care. We're left with the impression that Ruth might actually have been left out in the cold. We're left wondering if she made the right choice. And Naomi's not in a good place either. She's held onto her loss and defines herself as bitter and empty, a situation that she says has been brought about by God. And at one level, she's right. If God is in control of all these events, then she's right to see his hand in what happened to her. But while Naomi is right, she's also missing something. You know, throughout the story, we actually get to see some of the first glimpses of God's kindness to these impoverished and powerless women. Despite the death of her husband and her sons, Naomi hears news that God has provided food for his people. Despite the death of the men in her life, Naomi's daughter-in-law has stuck by her at huge personal cost. And Naomi and Ruth have arrived at Bethlehem just as the barley harvest, the time for gathering food, is beginning. And in fact, as we continue through the story of Ruth, we're going to see that these aren't just the beginnings of God's kindness to Naomi and Ruth, but these are signs of God's kindness to the whole nation of Israel and, in fact, the whole world. Well, having worked through the story, we're going to finish off just thinking about a couple of points of what this passage says to us today. We've already considered how the world does not offer lasting peace. And I mentioned a couple of ways that might help you think a bit more carefully about where you look for peace and security. But there's more. The claim of the Bible is that trusting God is worth it. We aren't called to return physically to the land of Israel, but the Bible offers peace to anyone who turns to God and follows Jesus. Jesus is the one who dealt with the problem of death when he died for our sin and was raised back to life, so that anyone who believes in him can have eternal life. Now, as we consider the story of Ruth and whether trusting God can lead to lasting peace, we need to be realistic about what outcomes we expect. If all we want is a comfortable life in this world, following God is no guarantee of that sort of peace. Trusting God won't make some of the problems we experience disappear. Lockdown, the threat of unemployment or recession, the possibility of sickness and dying, these problems will all still be there. If those are problems you are determined to have fixed and disappear, trusting God won't guarantee those are solved. In fact, just like Naomi warned Ruth, there can be costs involved in trusting God. But the message of the Bible is, despite the cost, it is worth it. In fact, there was a time when Jesus called a crowd along with his disciples to him, and he said to them, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" It's in Mark chapter 8, verse 34 to 37. See, the reason there is certain peace that comes from following Jesus, it's not because all our trials and troubles suddenly disappear, but because whatever happens, our ultimate end of eternal life with the good God who delights in showing kindness to his people is assured. And that's where there's lasting peace. And the final warning from the passage before I throw back to Martin and Q&A time that I want to draw our attention to is just the risk posed by bitterness. When life doesn't follow the plan that we have, there's a risk that we'd hold on to our grief so that it turns into bitterness. And the risk is that, like Naomi, we fail to see the first shoots of God's kindness starting to push up through the stony ground around us. In the midst of uncertainty, where can you find lasting peace? Well, the Bible says, actually by trusting God and following Jesus. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you. Perhaps we can, I know we're sort of out of time. Perhaps we can have just time for one short question. So here is one question. If you look at line 20 and 21, I mean, Naomi almost sounds like blaming God for her bitter life. And with the pandemic that we're going through, how should we think about, what's happening around us and what God is doing? I mean, should we be seeing the world and what's happening around the world as God's punishment for our sins? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, really complex question to ask in sort of a minute. So a couple of things in there. I think one is Naomi. I tried to show this in the talk, but maybe it didn't come through clearly. She's not a villain. I don't think she's bad. It's just that she hasn't quite got the right perspective. She's kind of got part of the story, but not all of it. She can see that God is in control over everything that's happened to her, and that's right. But at the same time, she doesn't see the ways that God is being kind to her, and she doesn't see the way God is using these events to actually bring about his good purposes for Israel and for the world. I mean, to be fair for that one, that's seeing well into the future beyond what her ability is. But she isn't trusting God in what he's done and what he's planning on doing.
Yep.
And I think there's similarity there for us today. We don't have a word from God or anything to say this, COVID crisis or any other suffering or thing we're going through is for a particular reason or for a particular sin. What the Bible says is actually the things that go wrong in the world are a result of sin generally, a result of the world being broken and fallen, but that God has actually acted to deal with that problem of sin by sending Jesus to die in our place. So if we are a follower of Jesus, that transforms the way that we see these things. It doesn't mean it's pleasant and that we love suffering and that we love difficult times, but it does mean that we can say, well, I know that God is good. I might not know why this is happening, but I can trust God's plans and purposes. And I can be encouraged to look around me at some of the ways that God has been kind and continued to be kind in the midst of difficulty. Now, that's, the whole issue of suffering is quite complex. And if you're going through a lot of tough personal anxiety and suffering at the moment, this is just a very quick overview of a broad position, and it's really worth sitting down and talking through issues, some of these issues a bit more, but at least gives a little bit of a framework there.
Sure. Well, and of course, this is not the last week. We're just starting a new series. So can you maybe tell us what we can expect next week?
Yeah, well, next week we're looking at Ruth chapter 2, and I believe we're looking at the place of kindness. We start seeing that in the midst of a time of uncertainty and difficulty, the significant difference that kindness makes. And we're also introduced to our other major character and love interest for Boaz. So stay tuned next week as the romance kicks off.
Fantastic. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you everyone for joining us, and see you next Wednesday.